I know you've heard this one before.
Do you know who the real fascists are? The people doing the real violence. And do you know who's doing the real violence? The anti-fascists. Here you have people who, regardless of what you think of their beliefs, are protesting peacefully, speaking peacefully, and not engaging in violence. And on the other hand, you have these violent, mask-clad thugs beating people with bike locks, lighting trash cans on fire, and literally committing genocide against windows. Can you sincerely tell me that these violent thugs, who won't even show their faces, the cowards, are more dangerous than the likes of Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos? These so-called anti-fascists are not just the real fascists, but they ought to be considered terrorists. We need the state to step in and throw each and every one of them in the deepest, darkest hole we can find. Anti-fascists do not deserve to see the light of day. The bones of this argument, as I have presented it, is not that violence is bad. The fascist or fascist-adjacent person whom you are debating with might want you and the audience to believe that they are saying that violence is bad, but what gives the game away is that they are suggesting that violence be used by the state against anti-fascists. What this argument says is that anti-fascists are wrong. Not because they use violence, but because they oppose fascism. It cannot be that violence itself is bad, or they wouldn't be calling for the state to leverage violence against people who are opposing them. There aren't really any variants to this, not any that are specific enough to need a specific rebuttal. This argument is meant for you, for the person who is arguing against fascism. And this argument is a threat. This is a specific threat against you, against your person, and against your beliefs. I've spoken before about how fascists are very good at leveraging the state into acting violently against people whom oppose them. That is exactly what this argument is. That is declaring an intention to do just that. Much more menacingly, this argument explicitly encourages people to lash out at people who oppose fascism. And we've seen that play out in real life. We've seen journalists get chokeslammed through tables at Trump rallies. We've seen people be assaulted by mobs, whipped up by demagogues, not just here in the US, but in Europe, and South America too. We've seen an increase in hate crimes. I've already spoken about that, just in this series. The best first step to responding to this is to remind people that fascists are literally out to kill people, have been responsible for the worst crimes that humanity has the power to commit against itself, and they continue to commit these crimes. The second step is to remind your audience that not only are fascists responsible for more deaths and terror attacks than literally every other group in the United States put together, but that anti-fascists have not been linked to even one death in this country. The third step is to remind your audience that not only do fascists frequently and almost exclusively target civilians, including children when they can, but that anti-fascists specifically and uniquely target fascists, usually for the sake of protecting people whom those fascists are out to assault. And you know what else? Don't apologize for opposing fascism. Don't apologize for working to see that people are not killed for loving the wrong people, or coming from the wrong country, or having the wrong skin color, or following the wrong god. That's not something you ought to be ashamed of. Fascism presents the single greatest immediate threat to every democracy on Earth. It needs to be opposed in order not just to keep those democracies safe, but to keep the people whom live under them safe. Do I have to do an editing run this week? Like, I'm sick. And I'm playing Dark Souls. So actually, I probably should do an editing run this week. Not just because it's a thing that I do, but also because I actually left a lot out this week. This week's video. So, first things first, it's egregious that I didn't mention this in the video to start with, but, like the thing I said about fascists instigating violence against anti-fascists, that, when you flip that around, when you have people threatening the use of the government against fascists, that applies to anti-fascists as well. The distinction between fascists threatening to use the violence of the state and anti-fascists threatening to use the violence of the state is not necessarily one of different means, but of different effectivity. The state is very poor at curbing the violence of fascists, especially right now, because the government is under the thumb of neoliberal capitalists, and those neoliberal capitalists need the fascists to defend them against the anti-fascists, who also want to challenge the neoliberal capitalist hellscape in which we all live. So in general, the police are going to be less effective when wrangling up fascists than they are when they're going to wrangle up anti-fascists. Incidentally, that's why anti-fascist violence against fascists is necessary, because the state proves to be very poor at curbing fascists from being violent. From being violent, especially to minorities, whom the state also benefits from the violence towards in a number of different capacities. I also at no point mentioned that, the fascists do know what they're doing. Like, I explained this last week, I think. People aren't stupid, and that also goes for fascists. But, like, when they say things like, oh, we're gonna call the cops, or, oh, the state needs to be violent against, oh, Antifa are terrorists, they know what they're doing. It isn't, like, an accident that they propose things that would disproportionately affect people who happen to be their enemies, specifically their enemies. That's actually what the title of this video means. When I say the devil advocates for his own, I don't mean that every fascist is devilish or is wicked, even though most of them are. What it means is that the fascists don't advocate for something on accident. They know what they're doing, and they know why they're doing it. When they propose policies that would do disproportionate harm to minorities that they've singled out for oppression, that's not an accident. They did that on purpose. When the fascists have laws passed that specifically target people who target them for opposition, often violent opposition, anti-fascists. There are laws like that in New Jersey, for example. That's not an accident. They did that on purpose. What the devil... I died. The devil knows who his people are, and when he sees them, he fights for them. That doesn't necessarily make the devil bad, unless the devil is doing bad things. Which, you could make arguments either way. Quite frankly, I'm of the mind that whether there's a god or a devil, we need to punch all of them. Punch all of them so hard that they die. If God did not exist, which it doesn't, then it would be necessary for mankind to invent God so that we could punch it. Incidentally, that doesn't mean that you can assume that people who propose fascist policies are automatically fascist. What the fuck is this thing? That looks nasty. Now, this doesn't just mean that you can assume that someone who sounds like a fascist is a fascist. Oftentimes, the fascists will, give the game away, but it's not something that they do automatically. Smart fascists, which is to say most fascists, won't do that. They'll have other people propose fascist policies under shittier ideas. Like that guy who was working for the RNC. You remember that guy who was on The Daily Show? Like back in 2009, I want to say, who was like, oh, we don't want to hurt the blacks, we just want to hurt the Democrats. I mean, he had to have known that those things weren't entirely dissimilar, but, like, you can believe that person. Mostly because he wasn't a smart person. At least he wasn't smart about... He was trying to be honest. But the person who proposed that policy probably proposed that policy specifically because they understood that it would very profoundly hurt people of color, especially in the voting areas. And we can kind of assume that because we can see that happening right now in the world. Fascists are very good at finding stooges, which is why I've been very careful to use the phrase fascists and fascist-adjacent... God damn it. Fascists and fascist-adjacent people. Because we're not just dealing with the fascists, we're also dealing with people who sound like fascists, or the fascists have groomed to seem like fascists. Someone like Armored Skeptic, for example, isn't a fascist. Greg isn't a fascist, he's just kind of politically ignorant of a lot of things. But he sounds like a fascist sometimes because he's hearing fascist talking points from his friends. By which I mean Carl Benjamin, you know. The guy who's now running for the fascist UKIP ticket. I know that UKIP says they aren't fascist, but they're not going to come out and say that they're fascists. Can we agree that UKIP is fascist? I'm pretty sure every reasonable person, even Nigel Farage, thinks that UKIP is fascist now. That's when you know you've jumped the shark. Nigel Farage, man who loves Donald Trump, thinks that the party that he helped found is a fascist party. They've gone too far to the right! I never thought I'd say it! I'm gonna stop that tangent. That's also one of the reasons that I go through the trouble of stressing that you don't want to oppose individual people exactly. You want to oppose specific policies and understand what the effects of those policies are. Like, we know what voter suppression does. That's why we oppose voter suppression. I hate that thing. We know what cutting social services does, especially to minority communities. It makes them suck. It makes their lives suck harder, which is something difficult to do, but entirely possible if you're a fucking capitalist. Capitalists delight in the suffering of minorities, it seems. No, but seriously, the fuck is this thing? I don't even have the faintest idea. Is it a chain devil? Is this a chain devil? Countering fascism isn't as simple as just fighting it head on. Like, I'm fighting this Bazatu, I think is what they're called in Dungeons & Dragons. Effectively fighting fascism means that you understand what fascists do and why they're trying to do it. You understand who they're trying to oppress and why they're trying to oppress those people. What marginalized folk that they're going after and why. And I know I said that before in my video about anti-fascism, but it bears repeating. Anti-fascism is about keeping people safe. Even the fascists, because when these fascists rise up in violence, they're a threat to themselves and everyone around them. What the fuck even is... This is my first time... Oh, fuck, more of these things. I hate these things. That's the reason why I wanted to go over all of these arguments specifically. Because it's not just a matter of opposing fascists out on the street. You have to oppose the policies that they propose, and you have to keep safe the people whom they would want to do harm to. And you do that by understanding how they talk and understanding what they talk about, especially when they're talking about policy. So I wasn't kidding about feeling under the weather. I'm very under the weather, and I am also legitimately playing Dark Souls. I don't know where I am, but it is very spooky. What the fuck is a Chasm of the Abyss? I've got a bit of a fever, and it's just a cold, but it's thoroughly unpleasant. I hate being sick. I'm thinking next month, I might just spend all month shitting on ANCAPs and their entire philosophy and why it's bad. And, in the process, explain some very basic anarchist principles. You know, because anarcho-capitalists don't actually understand... I made a list. They do not understand free markets, free speech, communism, or logic. Those are these subheaders. Subject to change. But yeah, that's the plan for next month. Shitting on the red and the yellow. No, wait. Shitting on the yellow and the black. I don't know what red and yellow would be. I need to figure out where I am and how to get out of here. It looks like fucking... Is this where NATO is? Until we get there, take care of yourselves, alright? It's just all blackness. It's all dark everywhere.